Hello, I'm Roger Watson and I'm the Editor-in-Chief of Nurse Education and Practice. And in this 10-minute session, I'm going to talk to you about the background section or writing the background section for an academic manuscript. We've already talked, and I like to recap, we've already talked about writing the title for an article, the abstract for an article, and then in the previous session, an introduction to an article. Each of these is very important and to some extent equally important, but they all serve a slightly different purpose. And the background, likewise, serves a different purpose from the introduction, and that's what I'm going to explain in this session. Now, just again to recap, some journals may not ask you for a separate introduction and a background. Some may say only an introduction, some may say only a background. But whatever that initial section of a paper, which may be around 1,000 words or so, whatever that initial section is, it should begin with an introductory section and then have a background section, again, whether they're headed like that or not. That sort of structure must be obvious to the reader. And as I've already said, the introduction sets the study in the widest possible context of policy and practice perhaps, but also research, and is very, very broad. The background begins to narrow this down a little bit and is more specific to what you're going to do in your study and telling the person why you're doing it and what you're doing it. So if I'll run through my analogies again with a shop. If the title is like the name of the shop and the abstract is like having a look into the shop and the introduction is going in and making a decision, the background is more about the things that you really want to take away with you and take away with you as a message before you begin to read the rest of the study. So the way in which I like to describe a background section is really, it's a literature review. By that I don't mean a systematic literature review, I mean a review of the literature which justifies your study and also helps to set it further in context and also indicates how you might approach doing that study. So really this is where you want to begin citing more literature than you did in your introduction. So having set your study in context with the introduction, the background may begin by saying something along the lines of previous work has shown that, and start citing that work, start citing the pieces of work and saying what they say. What you're trying to do is to justify your study and to identify the gap into which you're going to put your work, or indeed to some extent even creating that gap, being very clear that there is a need for your study. Your study may be a replication of another study, in which case that's a little bit easier, but you've got to make the case then that replication is virtuous because of regression to the mean and because studies differ, so you've still got to justify why you're doing it. But let's assume that your study is original, which most studies are. So your background will begin to introduce literature and will begin to, will present the literature on which your study is based. And remember that a great deal of that literature, maybe not all of it, and maybe slightly more than that, but a great deal of that literature will be the literature that you refer back to when you get to the end of the paper, to the discussion, because you're going to discuss your results in the context of the background. So what the background should do, and you can even do this explicitly if you want to, it should say what is already known about this topic, and then it should say what are the gaps that are not known, and that should justify why you're doing the study. And then it should say what you're going to do, without explaining all the methods. It should say generally what you're going to do to try to address that gap and indeed to try and fill that gap. Now, some journals ask you, and it's quite common for a separate section, a box, or even at the end of their abstract, they ask you specifically for what do we already know, what are the gaps, and how does this study address those gaps. But even so, I think you should have these 3 points in mind when you're writing your background. You don't necessarily have to put those in as subheadings, but you should be expanding on all of those points. So what we already know, that's the literature that exists. And what are the gaps? Well, the gaps may come from the policy or practice or educational or even research that you've introduced in the introduction, but also it could come from the papers that you're citing. Many of these papers could indicate future directions for research, and those are what you're going to pick up on. So you need to demonstrate some familiarity with that background. And then when it comes to filling the gap, you've got to then explain that you intend and that you have designed a study which is going to address that gap. Again, without giving away too many details of how you're going to do it, because the next section will be the methods section. So that's generally what the background is about. I would always advocate, and many journals do, but not exclusively, but I would always advocate ending your background section with a specific research question. You could even then augment that with aims and objectives, and perhaps if it's an experimental study, you may want to introduce hypotheses there as well, although they would more often be left for the methods section. So again, I think the shape of the article should be obvious, and it's beginning to take shape here from the introduction, which is very wide, down to the background, which is, you know, slightly less wide, but still having a broad look at the subject area, down to a very narrow ending, which says specifically what you're going to do by way of your research question. And of course, it's important to do this because the research question will dictate what sort of design you can use, and of course the design will dictate what kind of methods you use, and these will be explained in the next section, in the methodology section. So really it's a tactic in a way, your background. It's a tactic to justifying what needs to be done, what you're going to do, how you're going to do it specifically, and by what means. So make sure that all these things are congruent. Make sure when you're writing your background that you're thinking ahead to the methods section, where you will pick up from the research question what the design ought to be and what the methods are. For example, your background might end with a statement like treatment A, we wish to find out if treatment A is better than treatment B. Well, that would be only really possible with a randomized controlled trial. So you've set up a question, you may have a hypothesis to say that treatment B isn't better than treatment A or something like that. But you've made it clear what needs to be done, what sort of question you're addressing. So then when you write your methods section, which we'll come to next, you would state that you're writing you're writing about a randomized controlled trial, and then you'd describe the methods that you're going to use to run that randomized controlled trial. So again, the background section to a paper fits in sort of logically with the flow from the title through the abstract, through the introductory section, and then on to the methods section, which of course then leads on to the results section. So see this as part of a process of writing your paper. Try to see the background in context. It's one of the like links in a chain, and it serves an important purpose. And it's from the I'm speaking in a very practical way at the moment, but from the academic point of view or the intellectual point of view, it's the background that shows the reviewers and the experts that you really actually know what you're talking about. They should recognize that literature there. And as I say, it doesn't have to be comprehensive by any means. This is not a systematic review, but it should pick up on the main papers. So it shows the reviewers especially that you do know what you're talking about in this area, and it really is justified to do this research. So that again is another section of the paper completed, and that's all that I really want to say about the background section. I hope you found that useful, and once again, as usual, thank you very much for listening.